On Christmas morning 1923, only one member of the Harrington family walked out of their mansion alive. 16-year-old Eleanor told police her brother had poisoned everyone before shooting himself. But 50 years later, her deathbed confession would reveal a truth so disturbing that the nurse who heard it has never spoken a word. Before we dive into the story, what's the darkest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. Also, tell us where you're watching from today and what time is it right now. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now, let's continue with the story. The photograph was taken on December 15th, 1923, exactly 10 days before everything ended. Richard Harrington stood tall in the center, his hand resting on his wife's shoulder, with the casual authority of a man who'd never questioned his place in the world. Catherine Harrington smiled beside him, her pearls catching the winter light streaming through the parlor windows. Their golden retriever, Chester, sat obediently at their feet, tongue lolling in that universal expression of canine contentment. Marcus Harrington, 22 years old and home from Harvard Law School for the Christmas holiday, stood to his father's right. His resemblance to Richard was striking, the same strong jaw and confident bearing that marked them as men destined for importance. His hand rested on a leather-bound law book, a prop suggested by the photographer to emphasize his promising future. And there, on the left, almost as an afterthought, stood Eleanor. She was 16, thin and pale in her white dress, her dark hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features. Unlike the others, Eleanor wasn't smiling. Her expression was neutral, carefully blank, as though she'd learned early that revealing too much was dangerous. The photographer had tried 3 times to coax a smile from her, but Eleanor had simply stared into the camera lens with those unsettling gray eyes until he'd given up and taken the picture anyway. "Eleanor, darling, you look positively ghoulish," Catherine had said afterward, examining the photograph with a delicate frown. "Whatever will people think?" "That I'm honest," Eleanor had replied quietly. Marcus had laughed at that, the kind of laugh that wasn't really about humor at all. "Honest? Is that what we're calling it now? I'd say you look like you're plotting something sinister." Their father had intervened before the exchange could escalate, as he always did. Richard Harrington prided himself on maintaining harmony in his household, which mostly meant smoothing over tensions without ever addressing their source. Now, children. It's a lovely photograph. The Ashfords will be positively green when they receive their card." That was what mattered to the Harringtons. Not truth, not genuine affection, but the carefully curated image they presented to the rest of Millbrook Falls. They were the family everyone envied, the standard against which all others were measured. Richard's bank controlled most of the town's economic fate. Catherine's charity work was legendary. Marcus was destined for political greatness. And Eleanor was expected to marry well and continue the family's social dominance into the next generation. What the photograph didn't show was the argument that had erupted the night before. When Eleanor had announced her intention to apply to Radcliffe College, Marcus had scoffed at the idea. "Women's education is fine for teaching elementary school, Eleanor, but you're being absurd. Father's already arranged for you to debut next summer. The Preston boy is quite taken with you." "The Preston boy is an idiot," Eleanor had said flatly. "And I have no intention of marrying him or anyone else Father has selected from his list of suitable disappointments." The silence that followed had been profound. Catherine's teacup had frozen halfway to her lips. Richard had set down his newspaper with deliberate care. Only Marcus had seemed energized by the confrontation, leaning forward with something like hunger in his eyes. "You see," Marcus had said, turning to their parents, "this is exactly what I've been telling you. She has these ideas, these rebellious notions that she thinks make her special, but they just make her dangerous." "Dangerous?" Eleanor had laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm dangerous because I want an education? Because I refuse to be another decorative object in this mausoleum you call a home? You're dangerous because you don't know your place," Marcus had replied, his voice dropping to something quieter and more menacing. "And people who don't know their place eventually cause problems for everyone around them." Richard had ended the discussion with his usual diplomatic vagueness, promising they would revisit the matter after the holidays. But Eleanor had seen the decision already made in her parents' eyes. She was the daughter, the lesser child, the one whose dreams could be sacrificed to maintain the family's reputation and Marcus's trajectory toward greatness. That night, Eleanor had stood at her bedroom window, looking down at the snow-covered lawn and the town beyond. Millbrook Falls spread out below the hill like a kingdom, and the Harrington house perched above it all like a throne. She'd pressed her palm against the cold glass and whispered to her own reflection, "They'll never see it coming." Mrs. Davies, the family's cook, had been passing in the hallway and paused at those words. She'd tell the police later that she'd felt a chill run down her spine, though at the time she'd convinced herself she'd misheard. Eleanor was always saying peculiar things, after all. The girl had a habit of talking to herself, of muttering dark observations that made the household staff uncomfortable. But Mrs. Davies remembered something else too. Something she almost didn't mention to the investigators. She remembered seeing Eleanor in the kitchen late one night, reading through Catherine's recipe book, paying particular attention to the page marked Christmas Eve Hot Cocoa, Family Recipe. When Mrs. Davies had asked if she needed something, Eleanor had smiled, actually smiled, and said, "Just planning ahead, Mrs. Davies, just planning ahead." Now, as the Harringtons prepared for their annual Christmas festivities, that photograph sat on the mantelpiece, a testament to their perfection. The servants bustled through the house, preparing for the Christmas Eve party. Catherine reviewed the guest list one final time. Richard smoked his pipe in his study, reviewing financial reports. Marcus unpacked his trunk, hanging his suits, and organizing his law books with meticulous care. And Eleanor sat in her room, her journal open on her lap, writing in her careful, precise script. Years later, when investigators combed through her belongings, they would find that journal. But the entries from those final days before Christmas had been carefully torn out, leaving only ragged edges and unanswered questions. Whatever Eleanor had written, whatever she'd been planning or thinking or feeling, she'd made sure no one would ever read it. Some secrets, she'd apparently decided, were meant to die with their keepers. The photograph remained, though. Long after the house was sold, after the scandal faded into local legend, after Eleanor herself had become nothing more than a ghost story told to frighten children, that photograph survived. The perfect family, frozen in time, smiling for eternity. All except Eleanor, who'd known even then that perfection was just another word for lies. 50 years later, in a quiet hospice room in 1973, an elderly woman named Eleanor Harrington Webb stared at the ceiling and whispered to shadows. The nurse adjusting her pillows pretended not to notice. Patients near the end often spoke to people who weren't there. "I was so young," Eleanor murmured. "Just a girl, really, but I knew exactly what I was doing." The nurse's hand stilled for just a moment before continuing their work. Back in 1923, Marcus Harrington's journal told a different story than the one his family believed. He kept it locked in his desk drawer, the key hidden inside a hollowed-out law textbook. He wrote in it every night before bed, documenting what he called the Eleanor problem. December 17th entry, she's doing it again, making herself appear helpful, thoughtful even, while simultaneously arranging circumstances so that I appear unstable. Today at breakfast, she mentioned to Mother how worried she was about my lack of sleep. I haven't been sleeping poorly, but now Mother looks at me with concern, studying my face for signs of exhaustion. Eleanor has planted the seed. When I protested, I only confirmed her narrative. She smiled at me across the table. She knows exactly what she's doing. December 19th. Father received a letter today from Dean Morrison at Harvard, expressing concern about my recent erratic behavior in correspondence. I have sent no such correspondence. When I tried to explain this to Father, he suggested I was overworked. Eleanor offered to help organize my papers, to ease my burden. The perfect concerned sister. But I saw her at my desk yesterday. I'm certain of it. December 21st. I sound paranoid even to myself. Perhaps I am going mad. Perhaps Eleanor is simply being kind, and I've twisted it into something sinister in my mind. But then I remember the way she looks at me sometimes, when she thinks no one else is watching. There's calculation in those eyes, a coldness that frightens me more than I want to admit. What Marcus didn't know was that Eleanor kept a journal too. But unlike his locked diary, Eleanor's thoughts were written on loose papers that she burned in her fireplace each night, watching the words curl into ash. She left no record for investigators to find, no evidence of her inner world. The life insurance policy had arrived in November, a gift from their Uncle Theodore, their father's older brother, who'd made his fortune in railroads and never married. He'd established identical policies for both Marcus and Eleanor, each worth $50,000, a small fortune in 1923. To keep the wealth in the family, Uncle Theodore had written in his accompanying letter, should anything happen to one of you, the other will be provided for, though God willing, you'll both outlive me by decades. Richard had thought it morbid but practical. Catherine had tucked the documents away in the safe. Marcus had barely paid attention. But Eleanor had read every word of her policy 3 times, her finger tracing the beneficiary line. Marcus Harrington. Then she'd read Marcus's policy, noting her own name in that same critical space. Mrs. Davies, the cook, had worked for the Harringtons for 12 years. She knew the family's secrets the way all good servants did, through careful observation and strategic invisibility. She'd watched Marcus grow from a confident boy into an arrogant young man. She'd watched Eleanor transform from a lively child into something harder, more guarded. In early December, Eleanor had started spending time in the kitchen, something she'd never done before. Young ladies of her station didn't befriend the help, but Eleanor would sit at the worn wooden table while Miss Davies prepared meals, asking questions about cooking, about ingredients, about the properties of different herbs and spices. Mrs. Davies, what would happen if someone consumed too much nutmeg? Eleanor had asked one afternoon, her tone academic, curious. Well, Miss Eleanor, in large quantities it can make a person quite ill, confused, sick to their stomach. I once knew a kitchen girl who ate a whole tin of it on a dare. Poor thing hallucinated for hours. Eleanor had nodded, thoughtfully. Fascinating. And bitter almonds? I've read they have unusual properties. Mrs. Davies had felt that first flutter of unease then, though she'd dismissed it. Eleanor was simply an intelligent girl with an active mind. There was no harm in questions. But then came the comment about planning ahead, and the way Eleanor had studied that hot cocoa recipe with such intensity. Mrs. Davies began paying closer attention to what supplies went missing from her kitchen. Small amounts, nothing she could definitively prove. But she noticed. The neighbors noticed things too. Mrs. Pemberton from next door later told police that she'd encountered Eleanor on the street 3 weeks before Christmas. They'd exchanged pleasantries about the weather, the upcoming holidays. Then Eleanor had said something strange. "Enjoy your family while you have them, Mrs. Pemberton. You never know when everything might change." "I thought she meant she was going away to school," Mrs. Pemberton testified. But the way she said it, with that little smile, it felt like she meant something else entirely. Mr. Howard, who owned the pharmacy in town, remembered Eleanor coming in twice that December. Once to purchase headache powder for her mother, once to ask detailed questions about various medicines and their effects. She was very interested in what happened when different substances were combined, he recalled. Asked about therapeutic doses versus dangerous amounts. "I thought she was just a bright young woman interested in medicine. Now, I wonder what she was really after." In her hospice bed 50 years later, Eleanor turned her head toward the nurse. Her eyes, still that unsettling gray despite her age, were suddenly sharp and focused. "Do you believe in justice, dear?" Eleanor asked. The nurse, whose name was Sarah, chose her words carefully. "I believe in doing what's right." "Ah," Eleanor smiled, an expression that didn't reach her eyes. "But what's right and what's just aren't always the same thing, are they? Sometimes justice looks like murder, and sometimes murder looks like justice." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but kept her expression neutral. "You should rest, Mrs. Webb." "I'll rest soon enough," Eleanor replied, her gaze drifting back to the ceiling. "I'll rest forever. But first, there are things that need to be said, truths that need to be told, even if they destroy everything." The whispers started small, the way poison always does. Mrs. Pemberton mentioned Eleanor's strange comment to Mrs. Chen at the post office. Mrs. Chen told her husband, who shared it with his bridge club. By December 22nd, half of Millbrook Falls had heard some version of Eleanor Harrington's cryptic predictions about change and fate and things coming to an end. "That girl always was peculiar," Mrs. Ashford said over tea at the country club. "Too intelligent for her own good. Girls like that rarely end up happy." But it wasn't just the neighbors who noticed. The Harrington household staff exchanged glances when Eleanor passed by, their conversations dying mid-sentence. Even Chester, the golden retriever, had started avoiding her, slinking away whenever she entered a room. Marcus noticed most of all. On December 22nd, he cornered Eleanor in the library. The winter sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the oriental rug. Eleanor was reading, or pretending to, a volume of poetry open in her lap. "What are you doing?" Marcus demanded, his voice low and urgent. Eleanor looked up, her expression mild. "Reading Shelley. Would you like to hear? I met Murder on the way. He had a mask like Castlereagh." "Stop it," Marcus said. "Stop whatever game you're playing. People are talking about you, saying you've been making strange comments, acting bizarrely. You're embarrassing the family." "I'm embarrassing the family?" Eleanor closed the book with deliberate care. "That's rich, coming from someone father had to pay the dean to overlook your gambling debts." Marcus went pale. "How did you know about that?" "I know lots of things, Marcus. I know about the examination you paid someone else to take. I know about the senator's daughter you compromised, and the settlement father arranged. I know everything you think is hidden." Eleanor stood, smoothing her skirt. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" "You're threatening me?" Marcus's hands clenched into fists at his sides. I'm simply stating facts. Eleanor moved toward the door, then paused. You've spent your whole life believing you're better than everyone else, Marcus. Smarter, more deserving, more important. But you're not. You're just ordinary. And soon, everyone will know it. That night, Marcus wrote in his journal with shaking hands. She's not just planning something. She's executing it. Every word calculated, every action designed to destabilize me. I tried to tell Father again. He says I'm being paranoid, that the stress of law school has affected my judgment. Mother suggested I see a doctor. Eleanor sat at dinner looking serene, the picture of innocent concern. I'm trapped in a nightmare where I'm the only one who can see the monster. 2 days before Christmas, Reverend Matthews encountered Eleanor outside the church. She'd been standing in the snow, staring up at the building's stone facade. Miss Harrington, he greeted her warmly. Preparing your heart for our Lord's birth. Something like that, Eleanor replied. Reverend, do you believe in divine justice? That wrongs are always righted, even if not in the way we expect? The Reverend considered this. I believe God sees all and judges fairly. Even when men don't? Even when the guilty are protected and the suffering ignored? My child, are you troubled by something? You can speak to me in confidence. Eleanor smiled then, but it was the saddest smile Reverend Matthews had ever seen. We're all troubled by something, aren't we? The question is whether we have the courage to do what's necessary about it. She walked away before he could respond, leaving him standing in the snow with an inexplicable sense of dread. The pharmacy owner, Mr. Howard, mentioned to the town doctor that Eleanor Harrington had been asking unusual questions about medications. The doctor, who'd known the family for years, dismissed it as intellectual curiosity. Bright girl, that one. Probably wants to understand medicine for when she has children of her own someday. But Mr. Howard couldn't shake his unease. There had been something too focused about Eleanor's questions, too specific. She hadn't been casually curious. She'd been gathering information. On December 23rd, Mrs. Davies found Eleanor in the kitchen again, this time examining the family's special Christmas cocoa tin. The recipe was Catherine's pride, a secret blend passed down from her grandmother, rich and slightly bitter with dark chocolate and a hint of spice. Planning to make it yourself this year, miss? Mrs. Davies asked, trying to keep her voice light. Just appreciating family traditions, Eleanor said. Before they're gone. Before they're gone? You're not going somewhere, are you? Eleanor set down the tin. We're all going somewhere, Mrs. Davies. Some of us just know the destination. That evening, Marcus found his father in the study. Richard was reviewing bank documents, a glass of brandy at his elbow. Father, I need you to listen to me. Really listen. Eleanor is dangerous. She's planning something terrible. I don't know exactly what, but I can feel it. Please, you have to believe me. Richard removed his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes. Marcus, son, you've been saying things like this for weeks now. Eleanor is a 16-year-old girl. A moody, difficult girl, perhaps, but hardly a threat to anyone. You're wrong. You're so wrong, and by the time you realize it, it will be too late. Enough. Richard's voice held an edge now. I won't have you spreading paranoid delusions about your sister. Whatever rivalry exists between you two, you're both my children, and you will treat each other with respect. Do you understand? Marcus understood. He understood that no one would believe him. He understood that whatever Eleanor had planned, he was powerless to stop it. He understood that sometimes the most terrifying monsters were the ones no one else could see. That night, 3 people in the Harrington house couldn't sleep. Marcus lay awake, staring at his ceiling, his journal clutched to his chest. Richard sat in his study, troubled by doubts he couldn't quite articulate, and Eleanor stood at her window, watching snow fall on Millbrook Falls, whispering to her reflection one last time. 2 more days, just 2 more days, and everything changes. Justice, at last. Christmas Eve arrived with fresh snow and the kind of crisp, clear cold that made everything feel suspended in time. The Harringtons attended morning service at St. Peter's Episcopal Church, filling their usual pew in the 3rd row. Catherine wore her fur coat and emerald brooch. Richard nodded to business associates. Marcus sat rigid, his jaw clenched, dark circles under his eyes making him look older than his 22 years. And Eleanor, dressed in dove gray, sang the hymns in a clear, high voice that somehow made the sacred words sound like a farewell. Reverend Matthews delivered his sermon on forgiveness and redemption. Eleanor listened intently, her gloved hands folded in her lap. When the Reverend spoke about sins being washed clean, about justice belonging to the divine rather than to man, a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. After the service, the family lingered on the church steps, accepting Christmas greetings from the congregation. Mrs. Ashford gushed about how lovely Eleanor looked. Mr. Howard wished them all good health in the coming year. Mrs. Pemberton asked if they'd received her fruitcake. The fruitcake was delicious, Eleanor said warmly. We'll treasure it. Marcus shot her a sharp look, but Eleanor's expression remained innocent. The afternoon was devoted to caroling, another Harrington tradition. They joined the other prominent families, walking through town singing to those less fortunate. Eleanor's voice rang out sweetest of all on Silent Night, and several people commented afterward on how angelic she'd sounded. She has the voice of someone at peace with herself, Mrs. Chen observed. If only they'd known what kind of peace Eleanor had found. By 6 o'clock, the family had returned home. Mrs. Davies had outdone herself with the Christmas Eve dinner. Roasted duck, buttered potatoes, glazed carrots, fresh bread still warm from the oven. Chester lay by the fireplace, occasionally lifting his head when voices rose. The conversation at dinner was carefully pleasant, the kind of surface harmony that the Harringtons had perfected over the years. Richard discussed the bank's excellent 4th quarter. Catherine mentioned the charity auction scheduled for January. Marcus picked at his food, his eyes constantly flicking toward Eleanor. Eleanor ate steadily, methodically, as though fueling herself for something requiring strength. You're quiet tonight, Eleanor, Catherine observed. Are you feeling well? I feel perfectly clear, Mother, perhaps clearer than I've ever felt. That's an odd thing to say, Marcus interjected. What do you mean by clear? Just that I understand things now, how pieces fit together, how actions have consequences, how the truth always finds a way out, eventually. Eleanor took a sip of water. Don't you find that comforting, Marcus? That truth always wins in the end? Marcus's fork clattered against his plate. Excuse me, I'm not feeling well. He left the table abruptly. Richard frowned after him, then turned to Eleanor. What was that about? I have no idea, Father. Marcus has been so anxious lately. Perhaps law school is more demanding than he anticipated. After dinner came the tradition Eleanor had been waiting for, the Christmas Eve hot cocoa by the fireplace. It was Catherine's specialty. The recipe she guarded jealously, made only once a year on this specific night. Rich dark chocolate, cream, a blend of spices that gave it warmth and depth. Mrs. Davies prepared the cocoa exactly as Catherine had taught her, heating the mixture in the special copper pot, stirring clockwise exactly 20 times. She poured it into 4 porcelain mugs, each painted with holly and berries, and arranged them on a silver tray. The family gathered in the parlor. The Christmas tree glowed with candles, their light reflecting off the ornaments and tinsel. Presents wrapped in gold and silver paper waited beneath the branches. The scene was perfect. Picture book Christmas, exactly as it should be. Marcus had returned, though he looked even paler than before. He stood near the window, as far from Eleanor as the room allowed. "Come now, Marcus," Richard said heartily. "It's Christmas Eve. Whatever troubles you have can wait until the new year. Join your family." Reluctantly, Marcus moved closer to the fire. Catherine distributed the mugs herself, pressing each one into her family's hands with maternal care. "To family," she said, raising her cup. "And to the blessings we share." "To family," Richard echoed. Eleanor raised her mug, steam curling up around her face. "To truth," she said softly, "and to getting exactly what we deserve." Marcus stared at his cocoa as though it were a snake coiled in the cup. In her hospice bed, 50 years later, elderly Eleanor would whisper to the nurse, "I watched them drink it all, every drop. They never suspected the one they'd trained to be invisible." But on that Christmas Eve in 1923, the Harringtons drank their cocoa by the fire, talking about tomorrow's Christmas breakfast, about the gifts they'd exchange, about plans for the new year. They finished every drop of Catherine's special recipe, savoring the rich sweetness, the familiar warmth. Eleanor drank hers last, slowly, her eyes watching each family member over the rim of her cup. At 9 o'clock, Catherine yawned delicately. "I believe I'll retire early. Tomorrow will be such a full day." "Good idea," Richard agreed. "We should all get rest. Church service is at 8. They climbed the stairs together, Chester padding behind them. Marcus paused on the landing, looking back at Eleanor, who remained by the fire. "Good night, Marcus," Eleanor said. "Sleep well." He opened his mouth as if to say something, then thought better of it. The look he gave her was equal parts fear and resignation. Then he turned and continued up the stairs. Eleanor sat alone in the parlor, watching the candles on the Christmas tree burn lower. The house settled into silence around her, that particular quiet of a winter night when snow muffles all sound. She hummed Silent Night to herself, the same carol she'd sung so beautifully that morning in church. "Sleep in heavenly peace," she sang softly. "Sleep in heavenly peace." Then she stood, extinguished the candles one by one, and climbed the stairs to her own room, where she would wait for Christmas morning. The screaming started at 7:42 on Christmas morning, 1923. Mrs. Pemberton, preparing her own family's breakfast next door, would later tell police that the sound cut through the peaceful morning like broken glass. High, piercing, desperate. The kind of screaming that meant something unspeakable had happened. She dropped the pan she was holding and ran outside in her slippers, her husband close behind. Other neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by that terrible sound. They converged on the Harrington house, that grand mansion on the hill that had always seemed so untouchable, so perfect. The front door hung open. Inside, Eleanor stood in the foyer, still in her nightgown, her hands pressed to her face. She was the source of the screaming, though the sound seemed too large to come from someone so small. "Help!" she gasped when she saw the neighbors. "Please, someone help! They're all gone. They're all gone." Mr. Pemberton pushed past her, taking the stairs 2 at a time. What he found in the master bedroom would haunt him for the rest of his life. Richard and Catherine Harrington lay in their bed, peacefully arranged as though sleeping, except for the unnatural stillness, the waxy quality of their skin. They'd been gone for hours. Mrs. Chen found Eleanor collapsed on the bottom stair, shaking violently. "Where's Marcus?" she demanded. "Where's your brother?" Eleanor could only point toward Richard's study, her mouth working soundlessly. Marcus was in his father's study, slumped in the leather chair behind the mahogany desk. A revolver lay on the floor beside him. The scene told its own story, or seemed to. The police would later determine he'd been gone almost as long as his parents. Sheriff Thomas Whitmore arrived within 20 minutes, along with Dr. Phillips, the town's only physician. The doctor examined each body carefully, his expression growing grimmer with each passing moment. "Poisoning," he concluded. "The parents, certainly. I'll need to perform proper examinations, but the signs are clear. As for the young man," he gestured to Marcus, "the obvious conclusion presents itself." Eleanor had been wrapped in blankets by the neighbors, given hot tea she couldn't drink. She sat in the parlor, that same room where they'd shared cocoa just hours before, and told her story in a voice stripped of all emotion. "I came downstairs for church. We always attend Christmas service. No one was awake. I went to Mother and Father's room. They wouldn't wake up. Then I found Marcus." Her eyes were dry, shocked beyond tears. He must have done it. He must have poisoned them, and then couldn't live with what he'd done. Sheriff Whitmore exchanged glances with Deputy Morrison, a younger man with sharp eyes and an unfortunate tendency to question everything. "Why would your brother do such a thing, Miss Harrington?" He'd been acting strangely for weeks, paranoid, accusatory. He kept saying terrible things about me, about the family. Father was worried about his mental state. Eleanor's voice cracked. "I thought it was just the stress of school. I never imagined he was capable of this." Mrs. Davies arrived, having heard the news from a neighbor. She confirmed Eleanor's account about Marcus's recent behavior, his strange accusations, his increasing paranoia. "Poor Mr. Marcus seemed quite unwell," she said, wringing her hands, "though I never thought he'd go this far." The evidence seemed straightforward. The 4 cocoa mugs from the night before sat on the sideboard, each tested later, showing traces of a substance that shouldn't have been there. Marcus's fingerprints were prominently on all of them, which made sense, as he'd helped arrange them on the tray before his mother distributed them. But it was Deputy Morrison who found Marcus's journal in his locked desk drawer. He read through it quickly, his expression darkening with each page. The entries painted a picture of a young man spiraling into paranoid delusions, convinced his sister was plotting against him, seeing threats where none existed. "Listen to this," Morrison said to the sheriff. "Eleanor has turned everyone against me. Father thinks I'm mad. Mother looks at me with pity. But I know the truth. She's dangerous. She's calculating. She's planned something monstrous, and I'm powerless to stop it." This is dated 3 days ago. The sheriff rubbed his tired eyes. Sounds like he convinced himself she was the threat, decided to eliminate everyone, including himself. Tragic delusion. But Morrison wasn't satisfied. He examined the study more carefully, noting small details that didn't quite fit. The position of the weapon, the lack of certain residue, the way Marcus was arranged in the chair, almost too carefully posed. "Something feels wrong about this," Morrison muttered. "A whole family's been destroyed," Whitmore snapped. "Everything about this is wrong. But we have a clear narrative supported by evidence. Don't go looking for conspiracies where there's just tragedy." Eleanor was taken to the Pembertons' house, unable to remain in her own home. She moved through the next hours like a ghost, answering questions mechanically, accepting condolences with numb gratitude. Only once did her composure crack. When Mrs. Ashford embraced her and whispered, "You poor, brave girl. You're the only one who survived." Something flickered in Eleanor's eyes. Not grief, not relief. something harder to name. "Yes," Eleanor said quietly, "the only one." By afternoon, the news had spread through Millbrook Falls like wildfire. The perfect family, destroyed. The golden son, revealed as a murderer. The youngest child, orphaned on Christmas morning. People would talk about it for years. The Christmas morning massacre, though most would add quietly that they'd always sensed something wrong with that family. Too perfect, they'd say. Nothing that perfect could be real. Deputy Morrison stood in the Harrington parlor after the bodies had been removed, after the family had been photographed and cataloged and reduced to evidence. He looked at those 4 porcelain mugs, at the Christmas tree with its burned-down candles, at the presents still wrapped beneath it. And he thought about Eleanor's dry eyes, her careful answers, the way she'd known exactly where to send people to find each body. "What really happened here?" he whispered to the empty room. The house, of course, offered no answer. It kept its secrets the way the Harringtons always had, behind walls of respectability and perfect appearances. But Morrison made himself a promise that morning. He would find the truth, even if it took him the rest of his life. He had no way of knowing it would take 50 years, and even then, he'd never hear it. Deputy James Morrison couldn't let it go. While Sheriff Whitmore considered the case closed, Morrison spent his evenings in the station basement, poring over evidence that everyone else had stopped examining. The journal entries, the insurance policy, the witness statements about Eleanor's strange comments in the weeks before Christmas. Each piece of evidence had a perfectly reasonable explanation. That was what troubled him most. Marcus's journal detailed his paranoia about Eleanor. But what if he'd been right? What if the entries weren't delusions, but observations? Morrison read them again with fresh eyes. She makes herself appear helpful while arranging circumstances so that I appear unstable. The insurance policy named Eleanor as beneficiary for Marcus's $50,000. But Marcus had an identical policy naming Eleanor. Uncle Theodore had established both. Nothing suspicious about reciprocal family policies. The neighbors reported Eleanor's cryptic statements. "They'll never see it coming." But teenage girls often said dramatic things. It could have meant she was leaving for college, not planning mass murder. Morrison interviewed Mr. Howard at the pharmacy again. "Tell me exactly what Eleanor asked about medications." Howard shifted uncomfortably. She wanted to know about combinations. What happened when certain substances mixed. Therapeutic doses versus dangerous amounts. But lots of curious young people ask such questions. Did she purchase anything? Headache powder for her mother, nothing unusual. Morrison checked the powder. Ordinary aspirin, nothing sinister. Every lead dissolved under scrutiny. He examined the crime scene photographs again. The parents in their bed, peaceful. Marcus in the study chair, the revolver nearby. The positioning of everything seemed almost theatrical, too perfectly arranged. But the coroner's report supported the obvious conclusion. The fingerprints on the cocoa mugs told an interesting story. Marcus's prints were prominent on all her mugs, which Eleanor's attorney later argued proved Marcus had handled them while adding the poison. Eleanor's prints appeared only on one mug, presumably her own. But Morrison noticed something the others missed. The distribution pattern of Marcus's fingerprints was consistent with someone who'd helped arrange mugs on a tray, not someone carefully adding substances to each one separately. The prints were in the wrong places. He brought this to Sheriff Whitmore, who dismissed it immediately. "You're seeing shadows, Morrison. The man's journal confesses his intentions clearly. The evidence supports the narrative. Let it rest." "What about the life insurance? Eleanor inherits everything now. The house, The bank shares, Marcus's $50,000, which she'd inherit anyway as the surviving child. That's how families work. Morrison tried a different approach. What if someone wanted us to think Marcus did it? What if this was staged? Whitmore slammed his hand on the desk. Staged by whom? A 16-year-old girl? You're suggesting she somehow poisoned 3 people, moved a full-grown man into that study, positioned a revolver, and made it look like suicide? That's absurd. But Morrison had researched Eleanor's academic records. Top of her class in chemistry, excellent marks in biology, a paper she'd written on toxicology that her teacher called disturbingly thorough for someone her age. He interviewed Mrs. Davies again, pressing for details. Did Eleanor have access to the kitchen on Christmas Eve? Well, she was in and out all day, like everyone. But I prepared the cocoa myself, exactly as Mrs. Harrington taught me. I watched it the entire time. And after you prepared it? Mrs. Davies paused. I set the tray in the hallway for Mr. Marcus to carry to the parlor. That's our tradition. The eldest child serves the cocoa. How long was it in the hallway? Only a few minutes, maybe 5. 5 minutes. Enough time for someone to add something while everyone else was occupied. But who? Marcus, preparing to poison his family? Or Eleanor, executing a plan she'd spent weeks perfecting? Morrison discovered one more troubling detail. Eleanor's journal, the one she'd mentioned to friends at school, was never found. Either it had never existed, or someone had made sure it disappeared. Marcus's journal survived to tell his story. Eleanor's vanished, leaving no record of her thoughts during those final weeks. The investigation officially closed on January 15, 1924. Cause of death: poisoning by person or persons known, believed to be Marcus Harrington, who then took his own life. Eleanor Harrington, minor child, sole survivor, inherits family estate. Morrison filed his report, but he also started his own private file. He collected every scrap of information, every witness statement, every photograph. He labeled it simply, "The Harrington Case, Unresolved Questions." Years would pass, Morrison would eventually become sheriff himself. He'd work hundreds of other cases, solve dozens of murders. But he never forgot Christmas morning, 1923. He never forgot Eleanor's dry eyes, her careful answers, the way she'd positioned herself as the perfect victim. He never forgot how neatly all the evidence pointed away from her, how conveniently Marcus's journal painted him as unstable. And he never stopped wondering if he'd met one of the most brilliant criminals he'd ever encountered, a 16-year-old girl who'd committed the perfect crime and walked away free. But wondering wasn't proof. And without proof, Eleanor would remain what she appeared to be, a tragic survivor, orphaned by her brother's madness, deserving only of sympathy. Morrison kept his file locked in his desk drawer for the next 40 years, waiting for the one piece of evidence that would change everything. He would die in 1968, 5 years before Eleanor's deathbed confession, never knowing he'd been right all along. Eleanor left Millbrook Falls on a gray morning in February 1924. The Pembertons drove her to the train station, Mrs. Pemberton dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "You're so brave, dear, starting over after such tragedy." Eleanor, dressed in black mourning clothes, managed a wan smile. "Sometimes starting over is the only choice we have." She boarded the train to Miss Ashworth's Academy, a prestigious boarding school in Connecticut that had accepted her application and waived all fees out of sympathy for the orphaned girl. She took a window seat and watched Millbrook Falls disappear behind her, that perfect town on the hill where she'd spent 16 years being invisible. She never looked back. At Miss Ashworth's, Eleanor excelled. She was quiet, studious, unremarkable in every way except her grades. Teachers found her pleasant but distant. Other girls tried to befriend her, but Eleanor kept everyone at arm's length, as though she'd learned that closeness was dangerous. She graduated with honors in 1926 and attended Radcliffe College, the education she'd dreamed of. She studied literature and philosophy, maintaining perfect marks while living in sparse quarters and avoiding social events. The life insurance money from Marcus sat untouched in a bank account. She lived on the interest, never spending the principal, as though it burned to touch it. After college, Eleanor became a librarian in Boston, a job that suited her perfectly. Books instead of people. Silence instead of conversation. Order instead of chaos. She worked at the Boston Public Library for 37 years, rising to head of acquisitions, respected but never truly known. She never married, never had children, never spoke of her family except when absolutely necessary, and then only in the briefest terms. "They died when I was young," she'd say, and people, sensing her pain, wouldn't press further. Back in Millbrook Falls, the Harrington house stood empty for years before being sold to a manufacturing family from New York. They lasted 3 years before moving away, complaining that the house felt wrong somehow, cold even in summer. It changed hands 5 more times over the decades, never keeping residents long. The town stopped talking about the massacre eventually, the way towns do. It became local legend, a ghost story told to frightened children. The perfect family that died on Christmas, the brother who went mad, the girl who survived. But occasionally, late at night at the local tavern, old-timers would lean in and whisper, "But what if she did it? What if that quiet little girl planned the whole thing?" No one ever answered. No one knew. Eleanor received letters sometimes from people in Millbrook Falls. Mrs. Davies wrote once before she died, saying she'd always wondered, always suspected, but could never prove anything. Eleanor burned the letter without responding. Deputy Morrison, later Sheriff Morrison, wrote to her 3 times over the years, each letter more direct than the last. "I know what you did," the final one read. "Someday, somehow, the truth will come out." Eleanor kept that letter in a locked box, reading it sometimes when insomnia struck. She never replied, but she never threw it away either. The decades passed. Eleanor aged into a woman of means, living alone in her Boston brownstone, surrounded by books and silence. She attended library functions, donated to charities, maintained a respectable, if solitary, life. To everyone who knew her, she was simply Miss Webb, having taken her mother's maiden name decades earlier. A quiet woman, a tragic past, a life lived carefully and completely alone. Only Eleanor knew the truth about the weight she carried, the memories that visited her in dreams, the faces she saw when she closed her eyes. Only Eleanor knew whether she was victim or villain, survivor or killer. And she planned to take that truth to her grave. Until the cancer came in 1972, and Eleanor realized that some truths were too heavy to carry into death. The diagnosis came in October 1972. Stage 4, inoperable. 6 months, maybe less. Eleanor received the news in the same way she'd received everything else in her life, with composure, with silence, with that carefully maintained distance between herself and the world. The oncologist offered treatments that might buy her time. She declined them all. "I'm 75 years old," she told him calmly. I've lived longer than I deserved." It was a strange thing to say, and the doctor noted it in her chart. But Eleanor had grown accustomed to saying strange things that no one quite understood. She arranged her affairs with the same meticulous care she'd applied to everything. The brownstone would go to the library, her books to various universities, her considerable fortune, accumulated over decades of careful investment and sparse living, divided among literacy charities. She wanted nothing of herself to remain, no legacy to remember, except the truth. That, she was discovering, refused to stay buried. The nightmares had started years ago, but intensified as her body weakened. She'd wake gasping, her sheets soaked with sweat, the taste of chocolate and bitter almonds on her tongue. In her dreams, she was 16 again, standing in that kitchen, measuring and mixing while Mrs. Davies bustled elsewhere. Sometimes she dreamed of Marcus, his eyes wide with realization too late. Sometimes her parents, their trust absolute even as they drank what she'd given them. Sometimes she dreamed of her own hands, steady and certain, doing what needed to be done. Or did she? Even in her dreams, the truth shifted and changed. By January 1973, Eleanor could no longer live alone. She entered Mercy Hospice on a cold Tuesday, her few belongings fitting in a single suitcase. The nurses found her polite but distant, a woman who seemed to be waiting for something. Her room was on the 3rd floor, overlooking a small garden now buried in snow. She spent hours at the window, speaking to people who weren't there. "I was just a child," she whispered one afternoon. "Just a child who wanted justice." The day nurse heard her and made a note. Patient experiencing confusion, possible hallucinations. But Eleanor wasn't confused. Her mind remained sharp even as her body failed. She knew exactly who she was talking to. The ghosts that had followed her for 50 years, demanding acknowledgement. Nurse Sarah Jenkins was assigned to Eleanor in late February. Young, compassionate, with kind eyes and careful hands, Sarah reminded Eleanor of someone, though she couldn't place who. Perhaps herself, once, before everything changed. Sarah noticed what the other nurses missed. Eleanor's lucid moments weren't random. She was preparing for something, gathering her strength like someone about to climb a mountain. "Do you have family, Mrs. Webb?" Sarah asked one evening while adjusting Eleanor's pillows. "I did once, a long time ago. I was the only one who survived." Eleanor's eyes focused on Sarah with sudden intensity. "Do you believe people can be forgiven for terrible things?" "I believe in mercy," Sarah said carefully. "Even for someone who planned everything? Who executed it perfectly? Who walked away free while others took the blame?" Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Are you talking about someone specific?" Eleanor smiled, that same sad smile Reverend Matthews had seen 50 years earlier. "We're all talking about someone specific, aren't we? Ourselves, the things we've done that we can't undo." Over the next weeks, Eleanor spoke in riddles and fragments, about justice and revenge, about abuse and silence, about a girl who'd been invisible until she decided to become unforgettable, about the price of freedom and the weight of secrets. Sarah listened, piecing together a story that both horrified and compelled her. She researched Eleanor's past, finding newspaper archives about the Harrington Christmas massacre. She read about the family that died, the brother blamed, the girl who survived. And she began to understand that the frail woman in the hospice bed was carrying a confession that would shatter everything. "Soon," Eleanor whispered one night in March. "Soon I'll tell you everything. But you have to promise me something." "What?" Sarah asked. Promise you'll decide what to do with the truth. Not me. Not anyone else. You." Sarah promised, having no idea what burden she was accepting. Eleanor died on March 28, 1973, at 3:42 in the morning. But before she died, she told Sarah everything. It began at midnight. Sarah was doing her rounds when she heard Eleanor calling, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "Nurse, Sarah, please, it's time." Sarah entered the room to find Eleanor sitting upright, her eyes clearer than they'd been in months. The morphine drip hung unused. Eleanor had disconnected it hours ago, wanting to feel everything, to be present for this final act. "Sit down," Eleanor commanded softly. "And listen. Don't interrupt. I don't have long." Sarah pulled a chair close to the bed, her notepad forgotten in her pocket. This wasn't a medical moment. This was confession. Eleanor began speaking, her voice steady despite her labored breathing. She spoke for nearly 3 hours, her words spilling out like water from a broken dam. Sarah's face transformed as she listened, shock giving way to horror, horror to disbelief, disbelief to a strange, terrible understanding. At one point, Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide. Eleanor paused, waiting until Sarah nodded for her to continue. The story Eleanor told contradicted everything, or confirmed everything, or revealed something no one had considered. Sarah would never say which. But tears streamed down her face as she listened, and once she reached for Eleanor's hand, squeezing it tightly. "You were just a child," Sarah whispered at one point. "That's what I told myself too," Eleanor replied. "For 50 years. Eleanor's breathing grew more labored as dawn approached. She was running out of time, but she had more to say. Details poured out, names and dates and moments that had haunted her. Things she'd seen, things she'd done, things that had been done to her. "The poison was easy," Eleanor said, her voice fading. "Much easier than living with the silence. They all thought Marcus was paranoid, but he wasn't paranoid enough. He never suspected the real reason I needed them gone." Sarah leaned closer, listening intently as Eleanor revealed the final truth. The piece that made everything else make sense, or made nothing make sense at all. When Eleanor finished speaking, silence filled the room. The first light of dawn crept through the window, illuminating the tears on both women's faces. "Now you know," Eleanor whispered. "The question is, what will you do with it?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "I honestly don't know." "Good," Eleanor said, and for the first time in 50 years, she smiled with something like peace. "That means you'll think carefully. That means you'll consider all of it, not just the easy answers." Her breathing became shallow, rapid. Sarah reached for the call button, but Eleanor's hand stopped her. "Let me go," Eleanor said. "I've been ready for 50 years. I just needed someone to know, someone to carry it forward, or bury it. Your choice." "Eleanor, promise me you'll think about what justice really means. Promise me you'll consider whether the truth always serves the greater good. Promise me you'll remember that monsters are made, not born." "I promise." Eleanor's eyes closed. Her breathing slowed. In the final moments, she whispered something so quietly that Sarah had to lean down, her ear nearly touching Eleanor's lips to hear it. What Eleanor said in those final seconds would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life. 3 words, or a name, or a confession within the confession. Sarah's face went pale as she heard them. Then Eleanor took one final breath and released it slowly, her body relaxing into death with something like relief. Sarah sat with the body for 20 minutes before calling the doctor. She needed time to process what she'd heard, to decide what kind of person she was going to be. When she finally stood and looked down at Eleanor's peaceful face, Sarah made her decision. She would tell no one. Not because Eleanor was innocent, not because the truth didn't matter, but because the truth was so much more complicated than anyone could understand, and some secrets served the living better than exposure ever could. Or so she told herself in the years that followed, when she wondered if she'd made the right choice. Sarah Jenkins is 78 years old now, living in a quiet suburb of Portland, Oregon. Her hair is silver, her hands marked with age spots, but her eyes remain sharp. Those same eyes that witnessed Eleanor's final confession. The true crime researcher sits across from her, recorder running, notebook open. His name is Michael Torres, and he spent 3 years investigating the Harrington Christmas massacre for his podcast. He's tracked down every living person connected to the case, and Sarah is his final interview. "You were Eleanor's nurse in her final days," Michael says. "The records show you were with her when she died." "I was." Sarah's voice is steady, but her hands tremble slightly around her teacup. "Mrs. Jenkins, there are rumors that Eleanor made a deathbed confession, that she told you something about Christmas 1923, something that would change everything we think we know about the case." Sarah sets down her cup carefully. "There are always rumors. Multiple sources suggest Eleanor spoke to you extensively before she died. Her hospice records note unusually long private conversations. You requested no other nurses be present during your shifts with her in those final weeks. Why?" "She was dying. She needed someone to listen." "Listen to what?" Sarah is quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. When she speaks again, her voice is softer. "Mr. Torres, what do you think happened in that house on Christmas 1923? The evidence suggests Marcus poisoned his family and then took his own life. But there are inconsistencies. Deputy Morrison's private files, which were donated to the Historical Society after his death, show he believed Eleanor was responsible, that she framed her brother, that she committed the perfect crime. And you think I can confirm which theory is correct? I think Eleanor told you the truth, and I think that truth has haunted you for over 50 years. Sarah stands, walking to her window. The afternoon sun casts long shadows across her living room, across the photographs of children and grandchildren, a life built on stability and silence. "The truth isn't always what serves justice," she says finally, echoing words she spoke once before to another researcher who came asking. "Sometimes knowing destroys more than it heals. But don't people deserve to know? Doesn't history deserve accuracy?" Sarah turns to face him. "Let me ask you something, Mr. Torres. If I told you that Eleanor confessed to poisoning her family, to staging her brother's suicide, to walking away free after committing triple murder at 16 years old, what would that accomplish? Eleanor is dead. Justice can't touch her. It would only satisfy curiosity. So she did do it." "I didn't say that." Sarah's expression is unreadable. "What if I told you Eleanor confessed that Marcus actually was the killer? That everything happened exactly as it appeared? What if her confession was simply unburdening herself of survivor's guilt?" Michael leans forward. "Is that what she said? Or," Sarah continues, "what if Eleanor revealed that someone else entirely was responsible? That the real killer has never been suspected, never been investigated? What if the perfect family was hiding something so dark that murder became inevitable? Who else could have done it? Or perhaps," Sarah says quietly, "Eleanor's confession was that she'd been protecting someone all these years, That she took the suspicion upon herself to shield another. That her silence was the greatest act of love or the cruelest act of manipulation. Michael's frustration is evident. Mrs. Jenkins, please, just tell me what she said. Sarah returns to her chair, her movements slow and deliberate. Eleanor told me that the truth about that Christmas would destroy everything people believed about right and wrong, about victims and villains, about justice and mercy. She said some stories don't have good answers, only impossible choices. That's not an answer. No, Sarah agrees. It's not. But it's all you're going to get. Why? Why protect her after all this time? Because I promised her I would decide what to do with the truth. And I've decided that some truths cause more harm than healing. That sometimes the guilty one isn't who you think, or there's more than one guilty party. That the perfect family often hides the most devastating secrets. She meets his eyes steadily. Maybe Marcus was a paranoid murderer. Maybe Eleanor was a brilliant psychopath. Maybe they were both victims of something worse. Maybe the answer is all of these things at once, but the truth Eleanor told me was complicated, messy, and heartbreaking. It didn't make anything clearer. It only made me understand how little we ever really know about what happens behind closed doors. Michael turns off his recorder, defeated. You'll take it to your grave. Just like Eleanor did. Just like anyone would who understood what really happened. After he leaves, Sarah returns to her window. She thinks about Eleanor's final words, those 3 words whispered in the dawn light that explained everything and nothing. She thinks about justice and mercy, truth and consequences. She thinks about a 16-year-old girl in 1923, desperate enough to do something unforgivable, or brave enough to endure something unbearable. And she thinks about the choice she made 50 years ago to keep silent, wondering if it was protection or cowardice, compassion or complicity. The truth died with Eleanor Harrington Webb on March 28, 1973. But its shadow remains, cast across decades, touching everyone who ever asked, what really happened on Christmas morning, 1923? Sarah knows, and she'll never tell, because some secrets are too heavy to share, too dangerous to expose, too human to judge. The Harrington Christmas Massacre remains officially unsolved in every way that matters. And perhaps, Sarah thinks, as twilight falls, that's exactly how it should be. So what do you think really happened? Was Eleanor a cold-blooded killer who got away with the perfect crime? Was Marcus the murderer after all? His sister innocent? Or was there something darker beneath the surface, something that made murder seem like the only way out? Drop your theories in the comments. And if this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and subscribe for more cases that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about guilt and innocence. Because the truth isn't always black and white, and sometimes the darkest mysteries are the ones that are never solved.